So if I could ask the speakers to come and join me here. I know they are around. I can do that too. Okay. Where's Amos? What did you say? Now I can't talk anymore. Oh, there is one. Amos, if you'd care to join us here, maybe we'll get going.
Actually, I didn't mind it one bit. Actually, I didn't mind that one bit.
Well, continuing right along, and with only 5 minutes behind the lately revised schedule, or rather the joint effort here has put together a nice panel of experts. Amos Avidan is Principal VP and Manager of Petroleum and Chemicals Technology for Bechtel. According to what I read here, has been in this business for 23 years, which is a nice proof of expertise. William Ho is Manager of Global Energy Market Development for Chevron Texaco. Is in charge of responsible for generation evaluation and implementation of LNG natural gas market pull opportunities. He has also 20 years of experience in development of energy projects. Ira Joseph, you heard briefly yesterday, is an energy pricing or forecasting expert from PIRA. And Steve Loudon is Senior VP Development for Marathon Oil Company. I keep saying gas company, but I guess it's an oil company also. He has extensive business development experience in Asia, Europe, Middle East, North Africa. I think together they represent probably close to a century of expertise, if I dare putting myself in the club. And what we're going to do, each of these gentlemen will make his presentation. We'll try to keep it short. And we hope to have ample time at the end of those 4 presentations to enter into an active and proactive dialogue with you. I'd suggest, Amos, if you'd care to start.
Okay. There it is. I just want to make a few brief remarks about developments in LNG and pipeline technologies, and especially how they relate to some of the results you've been seeing from the model runs that have been run and some of the cases that assume technological change, costs changing, etc. So I'll talk a little bit, just a few minutes about the technologies, more importantly how these technologies tie to political and institutional factors and changing structures of the gas market, how do they interplay. And what I'd like to show you is that these are far more important factors than actual, what I would call real technological change, which has to do with changing pots and pans or process technology or metallurgy or anything like that. And finally, project structures and how the different players, countries or new companies that are coming to the business affect the business. And again, this is a far more important factor than anything else. And So all this discussion about declining LNG costs, if you remember the chart that James Ball showed yesterday, LNG costs were actually much lower 20 years ago, and then they began going way up. And why did they go up? I mean, the second law of thermodynamics didn't change in the past 20 years. Things didn't get much worse. It was mostly these two other factors, the political institutional changes, the market demands. When most of the LNG was going to Japan, the so-called Japanese model developed, where the costs were not important and the buyers, not only in Japan but also in Europe, were mostly utilities that were not driven necessarily to lower costs. And anybody who's visited, for example, an LNG terminal in Japan can know that there's no good reason why a terminal should cost $1.5 billion. I mean, it has a beautiful marble control room and a museum to LNG on site. And interestingly enough, most of the tanks are single containment tanks, but everything else about it is very expensive. And, you know, that's not a technological change of any sort. Actually, all the technologies involved in the LNG value chain are very simple. Shipping is shipping. Liquefaction is not much different than a refrigerator you might have at your own home with a compressor and power supply. Now, you can buy a sub-zero refrigerator that's beautiful and fits in and has a beautiful stainless steel panel and all that, which what my wife, that's what she did. Or you can buy a very simple one that's just as functional, just as efficient, and costs half the money. And that's what I'd like to show you, that's where a lot of the change is really there rather than in the technology. How do I switch slides here? Oh, okay. There you go. Well, looking at the liquefaction chain costs did come down significantly in the past few years, and I certainly agree with James fully about the dramatic effect that Trinidad had on the whole market and the whole rejuvenated Atlantic market. So costs did come down significantly. Recently, they began going up a little bit, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that commodity prices have gone dramatically up in the past year. So the cost of LNG storage tanks, for example, has gone up. One quick example of how costs have come down or going up or changing is, let's take something more that I'm not really an expert in and I can say without offending anybody maybe, is ships. LNG ships 10 years ago, for example, the Abu Dhabi ships cost something like $270 million each. Recently, ships are being bought in Japan and Korea for more like $160 million each. There was no change in technology. There was no change. If anything, the ships now are bigger, a little bigger than they were 10 years ago. It's just simply competition and other changes in the chain, which we don't have much time to go into, but a lot of you probably know what the factors involved there are. Yet, there is new technology. Technology does improve incrementally. Today's compressors in LNG plants are much better than they were 10 years ago. They're getting bigger, they're getting a little bit more efficient, but it's incremental change. And we like that change. It's change we constantly pursue and constantly make better. But these are not the big changes that suddenly cut costs by 50% or increase them by 50%. Looking at some of the three factors I mentioned in here, first of all, economies of scale. There's a lot of discussion about economies of scale. And in the chart that you see here, you see the cost of LNG plants. This is EPC cost, real EPC cost, which is not owner's cost. This is just what the owners contract with an EC company to build a plant for. So here's all the plants that have been awarded in the past 8 years or so versus their capacities. These capacities range all the way from 2.5 million tons to over 8 million tons. This has not been awarded yet, but it's just our estimation. And as you can see, there is what appears to be an economy of scale. But I'd like to clarify that this economy of scale is mostly economy of scale that's due to the whole plant getting bigger, not necessarily train size getting bigger. Just to give you another quick example, if you're building a jetty and a loading berth for LNG, that berth is good for up to 8 million or 9 million tons. If you're building a 3 million ton plant, it's the same cost as if it is a 5 or if it's a 6 or an 8. So there's a lot of built-in infrastructure that goes in when you're building a smaller plant. Same thing with LNG storage, same thing with ships, same thing with common facilities. You don't need to build another control room when you're building a bigger plant, for example. So there's a lot of in there, but there's a myth that if you just make the train much bigger, it's going to be dramatically cheaper. Well, it depends. Depends how much capacity you're building at the same time. Now, there are some differences, and it's not a simple answer. I don't try to oversimplify it here. And different size trains may be different for everybody. There are places where bigger trains do make sense, and there are places where they don't. Some of our clients are asking us to design 8 million ton trains, and some are very happy with 2 4 million ton trains. And it's not clear which one is better. It depends on the site, it depends on the build-up, it depends on how fast you want to sell the LNG, etc. So no simple answer there and no magical silver bullet in just economy of scale alone. It's a complicated issue. New liquefaction technology. I think that the Trinidad, the re-entrance of the Phillips Cascade, optimized liquefaction cascade process made a huge difference. If you look at that yellow table in here, in 1994, there was the old gold-plated model. There was only one technology. There's nothing wrong with that technology, but there was only one. Since then, there was a big change. As you know, Bechtel is a little different in this sense. We are basically, our core business is engineering construction. We built about half of the cases that you see being presented to you today in pipelines and LNG and all that. But in LNG, we took a different role, a second hat. We've teamed up with ConocoPhillips, and we are promoting and developing and building their optimized cascade process technology, which we believe is a better process. It's lower cost, it's higher availability, and lower operating costs for the owners. So there's big incentives there to use that process. If you look at some of the other things, for example, in 1994, plants were built with what's called N+2 redundancy, which means for every critical piece of equipment, there are 2 installed spares. Today, they're built functionally spared. What's really intriguing about this is Trinidad, as James showed yesterday, is the lowest cost plant that was built in the world so far, and yet it's the most reliable one. It's the cheapest one, but it has a 96% availability factor versus all the other more expensive plants that only have 93%. So sparing and redundancy don't do you much good unless you do them cleverly, in a clever way. And the costs have come down dramatically from $350 from some of the old Qatari plants to about $200 or so today. The total cost of the first 3 trains in Trinidad, trains 1, 2, and 3, the EPC cost is $150 a ton average for these 3 trains. It's the cheapest one in the world. And the schedules have been very aggressive. And lastly, well, maybe I'll show you that. Project execution was the last point I had on my first slide. How important is that? Again, I think it's a critical item. Project execution is important because there are different ways to build LNG projects. And there are 3 ways. There's the traditional way to bid everything that can take you 60 months or more. There's a way to do a design competition. James mentioned that for Train 1 in Trinidad. There's several other people who are doing that. That saves you some time and money. And there's a third way, which is this negotiated approach where you work with one contracting company and quickly convert this into a lump sum turnkey price. This is not a pain-free way, but it's a very fast way, very effective way. All the plants we are building are done this way, and we believe there's dramatic advantages in terms of net present value of hundreds of millions of dollars to the owners in accelerating their plans. But more importantly than that, we see a lot of the owners who use our services this way not only get the net present value, but are able to capture trenches of the market, which may not exist there if they were delaying their projects. You see some projects take many, many years to do, and of course the owners lose billions of dollars of it and lose markets. And there are some projects like Egypt or Equatorial Guinea or others who move very quickly, capture a trench of the market, and move on. And that to me is really what technological innovation, when it's described in these terms of project execution planning, this is where costs really come down and they benefit everybody along the value chain. Thank you.
William, how to come? Let's try to keep the time, please. Thank you.
I don't know why you made reference to me, but then again, maybe you've heard me talk before. I don't. But I'd like to say good morning and thank you for the opportunity to share a few of my own ideas and thoughts and our corporation's thoughts about our role in how we are involved in the gas market around the world, and particularly LNG. But I think to kind of frame it, I'll just share with you some thoughts about how we want to look at what the world market looks like for gas, where gas is and where it isn't, how that factors into the worldwide expectations for growth of the energy supply, but also to really to focus more in as we as operators, as some of our colleagues are in various other major oil companies, that we're also citizens of the world, and we have to be responsible in the places we do business. We just don't do business and move on. Oil is one aspect of our business. Gas is another, and it gives us the opportunity to really put into play the whole concept of sustainable development when you're building gas infrastructure in a country that is trying to develop processes such as GTL or LNG, because it does require infrastructure. Good slide, but not mine. But I think that's Amos's project execution slide. But really the agenda, while they get the slide up, I want to talk about in terms of LNG. Natural gas is the fastest growing energy source in terms of growing demand. The opportunities exist for growth in emerging markets, not only where it's being produced and where the resources are, but in terms of those economies trying to develop and move past. Natural gas brings considerable benefits in terms of obviously reduction in emissions. It also involves the ability, again, as I said, to build infrastructure. Because it is very difficult to build gas infrastructure unless you have large anchor systems in which to justify the expenditures. Now that we might. And in terms of an LNG technology is one of those methodologies of building that infrastructure. It needs very large scale. LNG or gas to liquids technology requires large scale gas quantities to be economic. Although processes such as fertilizer production or ammonia production obviously have tremendous value in the world, they are not very large consumers of gas. And if you're trying to build large infrastructure, it just doesn't make sense. So that's what LNG technology does for you. And again, responsible business development benefits everybody, not only as you as the investors, but also the countries that host the particular development. In terms of natural gas being the fastest growing source, world energy demand will grow more than half in the next 20 years. Fossil fuels, obviously, as we all know, will remain the dominant force, with gas growing the fastest. Worldwide, over the next 20 years, gas is expected to grow about 2.2% a year worldwide, varying from just under 2% in the United States, North America, to well over 3% in countries like India. So on average, it is the fastest growing source, which means we have to find more and more gas or put more and more gas into the marketplace. So much so that it actually will overtake coal as the second largest energy source in the world. And as we heard earlier today, the key driver is electricity. It is the large volumes of gas that are needed to drive the conversion over to cleaner power generation, as well as incremental power production facilities that are built worldwide. In terms of gas consumption, the horizontal bars represent the growth in gas consumption over the period up to 2025, with the bracketed numbers indicating in those particular regions what's the total consumption in the year 2025. So areas like Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union is growing approximately from about 25 to 39 TCF of gas. North America is growing from just under 30 TCF per year to 40 TCF. But you're seeing areas like developing Asia, large growth of 10 TCF, but going from 7 to 17. Western Europe growing almost, basically doubling in some respects. Central and South America going from 3 TCF to 8.5. Middle East demand growing in terms of chemical productions and other activities, growing substantially over the period of time. So you're seeing that it's not only gas being moved to the traditional markets of Europe and North America, but gas being moved within those regions to enable development, industrial development. In terms of where is the gas resources, again, no real surprises. Where do we need it the most? Europe and North America aren't the large areas of gas resources. It's the areas such as Russia and the Middle East and parts of Eurasia that are providing the large sources of future gas growth and supply. So what that tells you is you've got to move it to markets. Some can stay in the region, but others have to move across the globe. And how do you move it? Well, pipelines have their limitations, obviously, distances and cost, geopolitics, so forth and so on. How can you move it? Well, one method of moving it is converting into something, obviously a transportable form, whether it's LNG or GTL. You're converting it to obviously a liquid that can be more easily transported, obviously with greater flexibility than pipelines in building the infrastructure. But the natural gas being able to transport it brings benefits both to the consumer and the producer. Environmentally, in the areas of production, it reduces flared gas and ultimately greenhouse gas emissions by conversion to cleaner fuels. Power generation efficiency, by being able to use gas, you're actually in changing the power efficiency circuit and producing power much more efficiently. Industrial development, same. You're being able to provide the infrastructure to allow you to construct ammonia plants, fertilizer plants, and so on. And also an opportunity for regional cooperation, such as the West Africa gas pipeline, where you get countries to work together to build infrastructure. LNG is, again, a topic that we're all hearing a lot about today. It allows you to commercialize those large gas resources. It provides an opportunity for employment, economic growth in those countries. It can be transported long distances, and you can certainly debate over the economics of the distances. It is stored for peak demand, so it does help you on your seasonality in your marketplace. And also it does provide that basis for industrial growth, which is becoming a real issue in countries like Angola. And in terms of what we talk about being a good corporate citizen and sustainable development, is being able to develop these projects both with public and private partnerships, our equity partnerships, and our host government. We have the integration of social, environmental, health, and economic considerations in decision-making of sustainable growth. We have community engagement and development. Ethics and transparency is obviously a big issue, and responsible development is a priority for Chevron Texaco. But what we see is sustainable growth is not just creating jobs in LNG plants. It's creating the ability to provide resource capital, micro capital investment like we're doing in Angola, where you basically provide people the opportunity to grow their own businesses in support of these large industrial developments. Because in the end, you don't employ huge numbers of people in operation, but you want to be able to provide the opportunity for people to support the development of those projects, and therefore really put the sustainable development across the entire economy of the developing country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we'll ask Ira to continue and present us the market view, I suppose.
Being from New York, I'm used to talking quickly, so I'll definitely go as quickly as possible here. Thank you, Amy and David, for inviting me to talk about this. And what PIRA does is, I don't know if many of you hopefully know, we look at short-term supply-demand fundamentals and price forecasting. And what I was invited to talk about is how some of the things we see in the market today and things that are developing in the global gas market right now are going to extrapolate out over the longer term into the changing structure of global gas markets. And I would divide up the basis of my presentation into three basic parts: is flexibility, hedgeability, and availability. James alluded to the flexibility aspects in Trinidad Train 1, and I think that really has changed the market over throughout the entire world. In terms of in the different parts of the cycle costs of building LNG and liquefaction, we're seeing equity partners marketing more gas by company rather than by train, which means you're having a lot more partners out there. Which is also causing some problems as well, because as some of the speakers mentioned yesterday, Sonatrach and BP have very, very different interests in marketing LNG for the moment, until Sonatrach gets into the power business or BP gets involved in one of Algeria's trains. Even though they're marketing it together, they have very, very different approaches to the market, as would a Sonatrach Gaz de France type of deal. But as we can see in the market, producers are moving more into the power business. Shell, BP, obvious examples of that, and consumers and marketers are moving more into the LNG and the gas production. In some cases, the gas production business. You have TEPCO and KOGAS in Asia setting up offices all over the world because they realize that their power as very, very large buyers is changing, and their needs are changing because they're going to be using gas in other parts of the world and marketing gas beyond their traditional places in which they buy it. In the transport part, the transport tanker capacity is growing by at least 50, well, not at least, but by around 50% over the next 3 years. The tankers are getting larger. They're moving greater distances, and they're moving more non-traditional routes. What we're seeing in the market right now is really interesting, is that in the U.S. in the first quarter of this year, basically the U.S. went beyond what the capacity is for Trinidad, or at least what their stated capacity is to produce LNG, and that's going to change some things until Train 4 comes up in 4Q 2005 or 1Q 2006, because it's going to be, if the U.S. keeps growing, and I think it will in terms of LNG imports, it's going to have to buy it from somewhere from Trinidad. It's basically sucked Trinidad dry for what it has now, and that's going to impede on some of the more traditional routes that we've been seeing in terms of Algeria, Nigeria, Mideast, because the U.S. is going to demand more gas, and the price is going to reflect that. At $6.50 gas, the U.S. market is a very enticing market right now. We have $6.50 gas in Northwest Europe, and I probably Philippe wishes his terminal was about 3 times the size as it is now because of $6.50 gas this winter in Northwest Europe, but unfortunately it isn't yet. In terms of regasification, it was covered mainly yesterday that a lot of regas facilities are moving from a toll-in function to more of an integrated chain. I won't go over that, but I do think that there is room for both in this market. And you have rooms for the Cheniers and the Fall Rivers of the world, and also the majors. Interesting, in Europe, some of the new regas facilities are being built under use it or lose it philosophies, which is to say that the capacity of the owner, if it's not being used, has to be offered to a third party afterwards, which I think is a sort of an interesting compromise between no third-party access and complete third-party access. And one more thing I wanted to mention in transport is that even today you can see the inefficiencies in the market of trade right now, because you have BG doing spot deals for 17 cargoes to the U.S. market from Malaysia at the same time that Nigerian LNG is going to Taiwan. And obviously in a more efficient market, in an oil-type market that's more evolved and more complex, you're not going to see things like that. How do I switch slides? Or does someone do that for me? Yellow button? Go down here? Excellent. Okay, hedgeability. I think what we're seeing temporarily, and I don't see this for the very long term, but we're seeing the rise of Brent as a marker for LNG. A very large and significant project in Asia is using Brent as indexation for its sales of its gas, and we're also seeing Brent, dated Brent particularly, being used for Mideast LNG deals into Europe right now. That you never really saw before. Every region had its own basis. Henry Hub was in the U.S., gas, oil, and fuel oil mainly, and crude to some extent in Europe, and the JCC price in Asia. But that's definitely changing, and I see sort of Brent sort of filling that role temporarily until we get more of a global gas hub. I tend to be more biased to think that because the European market has more flexibility in terms of net imports from pipeline and LNG, that the actual global hub could actually end up evolving and becoming a reality more in Northwest Europe than particularly Henry Hub. But obviously that's a matter of some contention and beyond what we're talking about here. Trains, as many of you know, are being built with less pre-sold volume, which is an interesting aspect of the market, because if you go to a Brent or some type of global marker, it's a lot easier to hedge production or hedge purchases into the future. What I call the Arun dilemma, which is tied to that Nigerian deal I talked about into Taiwan, is that Arun is running out of gas, and certain Indonesian contracts are not able to fulfill some of its contracted volumes, and they're buying gas from other producers in order to fulfill that market. And that's, with regard to yesterday, the only thing that I would sort of disagree with is that I definitely see room for middlemen in the LNG market. Absolutely. I think anybody who can deliver gas to a customer can be a middleman in the LNG market. Just about anywhere in the world. But again, that's beyond the scope of maybe what we're talking about here today. And the transport shift to FOB sales clearly provides a lot more flexibility for cargoes, particularly Mideast cargoes to east or west, when the arbitrage dictates in the future where they'll go. The third part of this is availability. And the increased use of gas for the power sector shortens up the ramp-up phase in certain countries. And what I mean by that is traditionally, when you bring a train on, and as the trains get larger and larger, the supply availability is there instantaneously, but the demand doesn't necessarily grow instantaneously at the same time. But the more power that's being tied to LNG, the ramp up in demand, it comes in much bigger chunks, because when you open up a new CCGT in Spain, for example, you're going to use all the gas you can to produce as much electricity as you can, and from day one, although that can also be affected by hydro availability, coal prices, and other alternative potential power sources, or even imports into power imports into those markets. This will potentially create less spot availability when the new trains emerge, and that has really been the bread and butter of the spot market since 1995, is that when new trains came on, the demand wasn't there right away, and so you could sell the gas to other people when tanker availability was ready. And so this traditional form of spot availability is going to shift from what I think is project-related timing and growth of the market into what I call more commercial issues in the market, in terms of supply-demand on a seasonal basis and price differentials among different markets around the world. Just to go through a couple quick charts here, because I think this is an important point, is that global demand in different regions operates very, very different seasonally. In Asia, you have a first quarter peaking market in terms of demand. In the U.S., purchases tend to be higher in the summer than the winter, although I think that's changing over time. And then in Europe, it's all over the place, because the European market is very different in the north and the south. The south is evolving into a summer peaking power market, so you're going to have more LNG purchases in the summer in southern Europe, but in northern Europe, which is the bulk of the demand in the market, it's particularly fourth quarter and first quarter, which is really the most important time for demand. And just to quickly go through this, in Asia itself, you have very, very different demand profiles on a seasonal basis. Japan is a double peaking market in the third and first quarter, and then they inject and withdraw gas twice from storage. Korea is a winter peaking market, and Taiwan is actually a summer peaking market. In terms of spot imports by region, spot imports as a percentage of total imports, as you can see, are very much more important in North America than in Asia. Although up until last year, the Asian market was actually the largest spot buyer of spot LNG in the world. So there's sort of linear growth in Europe and the U.S. in terms of spot purchases, but as you can see, the seasonality and weather issues and nuclear issues and coal prices in particular have a very, very dramatic effect on the way Asia buys spot LNG, which is somewhat different than the way the U.S. and Europe buys it. Last year was a record year for spot LNG cargoes sold. It was up over 250. When we did a sort of our optimized look at liquefaction capacity that was not sold after you net out all imports of contract gas and spot gas, there was still, if you looked at optimized in terms of billion-ton miles, it's still probably 250 cargoes out there that could have been sold last year that actually weren't sold. And that has to do with shortage in tanker capacity and different regional parts of the market, but mostly has to do with tanker capacity and just an inability to get the deals done, which, as people pointed out yesterday, is a very, very complex idea. Finally, my last slide is really what I call the big picture of the market. And seasonality and storage is really an important factor, I think, in LNG markets. Is that I don't think a lot of people realize is that in the U.S. and the European markets, you have very, very, very big storage injection seasons, which changes the way LNG is bought in ways different than the Asian market. The Asian market is the largest LNG market, but it essentially has no storage. So it needs sort of more on-time availability of LNG, which is to say, when you look at those curves of demand, that Japan doesn't need a lot of LNG in the second quarter, and that's why a lot of it comes to the U.S., but it does need a lot in the third quarter, which tends to tighten up availability globally during that period. Another point that I think is also very important is that the shift in industrial gas demand away from traditional markets is creating more demand on power and residential commercial sectors for growth. And this is to say that I don't think people are realizing are focusing on, everybody's talking about how demand is going to grow in LNG or gas in the power sector, but there's a tremendous amount of demand destruction going on in the UK market, in the US market now, in terms of industrial gas use, where chemical producers, aluminum producers, steel producers are either moving to developing markets or to where the source of the gas is. And so I think some of the sort of euphoria about runaway demand growth because U.S. supply is falling and UK supply is falling is a little bit overdone, because people aren't factoring in a lot of demand destruction at $6 gas. Just those two more points and I'm done. as I said before, the spot markets were growing in different parts of the world for different purposes because the Asian and U.S. buyers are necessity buyers and not choice buyers, whereas Europe is much more of a hybrid market, and there's a lot of swing demand in that market, a lot of swing potential to come in for pipeline gas as well as LNG, and the European market will be kicking out a lot of spot cargoes that it won't be using itself into other markets, as we've seen Gaz de France do to the extreme in the last 2 quarters, where they've just bought more Dutch gas and pushed out a lot of their LNG into other markets. And I think in general, because there was my last point is that I think there's a greater risk out there in terms of demand disruption in the long term than supply disruption. I think the changing nature of laws and legislations in all the major markets is a big unpredictable factor that will change the nature of how regasification works and how liquefaction works, and in terms of tanker ownership and security issues. And then also in terms of the new emerging markets, where changing pricing terms in India and China are beginning to have an effect on the traditional markets as well. It's about as fast as I can go.
As far as speed is concerned, you did pretty good. Thanks a lot. Steve?
Well, Jean-Marc mentioned to me about 15 minutes ago that I had 8 minutes to play with, so I'm going to go reasonably fast and stick it at a reasonably high level. And I was very interested to hear Amos's comment about the fact that LNG trains are getting lower and lower in cost, and since he's building one for me now, he ought to be reducing the price. I guess in order to talk about how the politics and economics of gas play, maybe we can just touch for one moment on oil. And there's a great debate raging about whether gas prices are going to be a function of demand and supply, or whether they're going to be a function of politics. Well, is today's price of oil being driven by demand and supply, or is it being driven by politics? And I think we all know the answer to that. So, we'll talk a little bit about high-level stuff, but there's a starter point. It's interesting to note we're going from local markets to global markets. And as we go from local markets, and this is a very local market, as we go to bigger and bigger transport distances and wider global markets, then we begin to see a really different form of economic and political relationship developing. We've all heard about gas demand. These curves are pretty simple. They've been used many, many times. We can argue about population centers in China and India driving it. We can argue about the US market. We can argue about lots of things. But what's very clear is gas demand is very strong. And then we look at who's burning the gas. This is a satellite picture of the world. You can't actually take one satellite picture of the whole world at one go at night, but it's just 2 pieces put together. But the bright areas show you where the gas is being consumed. They're not new to any of us, but what is interesting, when we take each of these regions and look at the relationship between demand and supply, and we see in North America we've just moved into a supply shortfall situation, which is forcing prices very high. In Europe, we see the same thing. There's already a significant gap between supply and demand, but it's growing at actually a greater rate than it is in North America. So by 2007, the situation in Europe is going to be more dire than the situation in North America. In Russia and certainly Eastern Europe, we see strong demand growth, and we see supply keeping up pretty much with that demand. In developing Asia, we see even stronger demand growth, and we see a crossover between supply and demand taking place in 2015. And then, of course, in industrialized Asia, we see smaller demand growth, but the gap being pretty constant throughout. So I guess the overall message here is that supply in the areas of strong demand is clearly grossly insufficient. Another interesting element to the politics of gas is what signals is the market's giving us. And we're seeing in North America a convergence between oil prices and gas prices. Even today, at $40 oil, we're seeing $6.50 gas. You can do the maths. They're actually very similar on a BTU basis. Whereas in Asia Pacific, we're seeing the opposite. Since 1980, these are the LNG delivery curves into the Japanese market, the price is coming steadily down. And in fact, the last contract done on Tenggu into China is perhaps the lowest LNG supply on record into the region if you extract India, which is a special case. The question is, when does it bounce? Well, it bounces at the marginal cost of supply. I think we're there. So we're now going to see prices in Asia beginning to go up again. And who's got the gas? Well, you can see 10 countries have 80% of the gas resource. And of those 10, Russia, Iran, and Qatar hold the biggest proportion. And then Iraq holds some, Venezuela holds some, Nigeria holds some, Algeria holds some. And with those country names in the mix, is it surprising? Politics is important in driving the gas business. So let's take some examples. Bolivia, landlocked, so geographical isolation, difficult to get the gas to market. Take the second case, Iraq, about 110 TCF, a little bit of instability at the present, so difficult to get to market. Russia, plentiful resource. Some people say 65% of the gas is actually in Russia on a yet-to-be-discovered basis. Limited pipeline capacity, Europe, difficult issues in the Arctic. We need new tankers that can ship through the ice. And then we take Alaska. People call that an economic hurdle, or maybe an environmental hurdle, but certainly a hurdle about price. The question is, but are they all really political? And if you dissect each one of those cases, I think there is a political core at the center of all those cases. Then we look at the price side. There's a very simplified basis, but to produce and liquefy gas costs about $2. To ship it, regas it, and put it into the market costs about $2. So we know we can get gas from almost anywhere to anywhere for $4. And the price signals in the market are clearly saying they can afford $2. So it looks like, in a perfect world, supply would be able to meet all the demand. So cost stack that you're all very familiar with just repeats the same message. There are plenty of options to put gas into the US market by LNG at less than $4 a million BTU. And there are plenty of other options. This is just a slide of how LNG relates to the other forms of hydrates and GTL and CNG and et cetera, et cetera. And LNG can certainly compete with almost anything to attract the supply. The other interesting situation, which is once again economic and not political, but is interesting to touch on, is there are 86 companies with a market cap of more than $1 billion in 1992. There are 42 today, and only 14 of those have the capacity to do LNG. The market's talking about needing 22 trains. Each train costs $4 billion from all the way downstream to all the way upstream. That's $88 billion of investment being met by those companies. That's a tall order by any stretch of the imagination. So the developers are going to be selective. They're going to choose the places that are most predictable, and those places, therefore, that have the least political risk. So just a picture of what Marathon's up to. The blue areas represent our current activities. We're in many places in the Pacific Basin, both in the supply side, the market side, and the LNG resource side. We're looking hard at Libya. We have 16.7% of Oasis, which has enough gas to do a couple of trains. And we're looking at Qatar, Russia, and Indonesia for future options. A recent option we're just in the process of putting to bed on a commercial basis is in Equatorial Guinea. 60,000 barrels of condensate, 20,000 barrels of LPG, 20,000 barrels of methanol, 75,000 barrels equivalent of LNG. That's just under 200,000 barrels a day of gas equivalent. This is effectively a gas refinery. And the stronger the liquid yield upstream, the more attractive these sorts of projects are. So what does all this mean? In a perfect world, there's not 1,000 years of gas reserves, there's 100 years of gas reserves, but it was to get your attention again on the last slide. So there's huge resources available, and the major demand centers are clearly short. And the economics of long-distance gas work. So in a perfect world, we'd see these economic models and these flows all happening, but we don't see them happening. And the real world says there are still some technical issues around $4 a million BTU. Not a great number, but there are still some. And the domestic markets don't want to pay more than the price needed to export the market, to export that gas into LNG. That's a significant issue that's going to get more difficult to deal with. And there are still challenges in estimating above-ground risks on 30-year projects. We're investing significant billions of dollars. We need to understand what the world's going to look like 30 years from now. And in all those countries I outlined to you, we don't know what they look like in 30 years' time. So we have a big political issue to resolve. And the market regulators are disconnected from the supply administrators. We see this in the US today. Whether they'll ever get together in the same place at the same time, I doubt. So it'll be up to the producers to sort that one out. But it's a difficult issue. And the world is changing faster than the lead time for complex commercial arrangements. The last LNG project put together was about a 4 to 5 year time period to build the commercial arrangements. The one we just finished in Equatorial Guinea we put together in about 3 years. But that's still a longer time frame than the way in which the world of politics is changing. So I think, in conclusion, politics are clearly at the center of this business. And to leave you with the thought that this is not new, People have been looking at gas since 1942, and your great President Roosevelt asked us to continue looking at solutions for the gas. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. This was both quick and insightful. I will ask the other guilty parties of this morning to join us at the table. We are now open to questions, and we'll try to answer them. Maybe I'd like to try to just summarize what I have learned both yesterday and this morning. And it falls into a fairly short number of statements. Statement number one, we clearly have two very different development models competing with each other. One is the old-fashioned railroad track going from point A to point B. The other one is the flexible model a la Atlantic LNG. We also learned that Europe and America are very different markets, and one conclusion applied to one should not necessarily be used for the other one, and we don't talk about the Pacific. The Pacific is today the largest LNG market, is likely to stay so, with great growth potential in India and China. The third one is that we are in a $6 a million BTU market environment right now. And a question I have is that sustainable, and for how long? In other words, how much time do we have to bring more supply to satisfy the demand so as to bring the price down back to something reasonable before demand is destructed and our expensive and long-term efforts to develop those new capacities are wasted? So maybe I'll start with that question to the panel. And then I'll, of course, you're free to go your own. But how long do you think we can support a $6 plus million BTU market?
Well, maybe, Jean-Marc, I'll pick that up first. I think I'll start off answering the question in reverse. When people talk about demand destruction, I don't see it that way. I call it demand moving. People are still going to make fertilizer, they're still going to make urea, they're still going to make many things apart from electrical power, which can't be transmitted. So those users are going to migrate to the resource. So I'm not sure we're going to have demand destruction on a total basis. I think $6 is sustainable as long as the oil price is high. If we see $25 oil prices, we'll see lower gas prices. People will start to fuel switch. Clearly, they already are. So I think that's the message. We should expect to see high gas prices all the way through 2007 when LNG arrives in large scale, if oil prices stay high. If oil prices drop, we'll see more like $4 a million BTU.
Anyone else care to comment?
Yeah, can I say 650 we're talking about in this country, and talking about logical use of gas. I was in India recently, and where they are importing LNG to make fertilizer. Now that sounds pretty crazy since it's coming from the Middle East, and where I would make Indian fertilizer is in the Middle East. When you put that question to rational people in India, what they will say is, yes, but those fertilizer plants are sunk cost. So while we're using that capacity, and while the Indian government is kindly subsidizing the price of fertilizer, that does make economic sense. But all new stuff should go basically to the Middle East. Then, however, you have to get the Middle East hosts to allow Indian investors to have a proper share in those plants. So the odd thing is that when you look at rational location of chemicals versus LNG versus the other monetization routes, you find that you can very quickly get, simply with the behavior towards investors of host governments, to massively distort the thing. And the other picture that a lot of people forget is this point about sunk cost. People are not going to build a brand new chemical plant where you think it ought to be, when there's an existing one that can still get by on sunk cost at a higher price. So I think those dynamics tend to be not factored in as often as they should be.
Thank you. David.
I'd like to ask a question to James Ball and to Amos Avedon about the beginning of Amos's talk, which is pretty dramatic because it's at least contrary to what I think a lot of folks have been thinking. Do you, James, agree with Amos's assessment about the what appears to be the prospect for the cost of doing LNG? And Amos, what's your thinking about the structure of this market? Has this revolution, because of Trinidad, because of Egypt, has the revolution already taken place, and now what we're just talking about are some different trajectories on cost lines, or is what you're saying something that we need to be really focused on because it potentially could dramatically affect the unfolding of this LNG revolution in this global gas market? Well,
if I can just take it first, I was busily writing things down during Amos's talk because I absolutely love his sub-zero example. Because I've been using the analogy of the refrigerator for years, but what he added was the concept that, at least in my economics course, we call the Giffen good. The gold-plated LNG refrigerator, you can do it by choice or necessity. And that upward cost curve was quite clearly a choice because people had no discipline in a market where utilities passed everything through. So a lot of people looked at Trinidad at the time and they said, well, you see, the Phillips process was inherently superior to the APCI, and that's what brought the cost down. And I would totally agree with Amos. However wonderful it is, and you know, he can make his case for the odd percent here and there, what drove the cost down in Trinidad is they were willing to consider a different technology, willing to have real competition, and therefore most of the cost reduction was what I called a commercial factor. And and this is my big objection to pure economic modeling, is that simple factor of people choose to do the wrong thing has to be factored in. Likewise, people can choose to do the right thing. And the reason the Trinidad partners chose to do the right thing was that they figured that unless they were mega competitive on cost, they could not afford to serve the market that they'd identified. So I think those are big factors, and they remain big factors in the Pacific, where until they allow flexible project structures, until they are willing to go out and do some branded LNG and things like that, they will have a higher cost base by choice as opposed to by necessity. So his pots and pans versus political and commercial factors, I think, is the right thesis. And I think Trinidad proves that more than any pots and pans cost reduction that it might also prove.
I'd just like to add that, yeah, I believe that there has been a step change in costs with Trinidad, which didn't only benefit Trinidad, it benefited everybody. If you look at all the projects which are going ahead now, all their costs are lower. Now, future costs, I think we took a lot of the costs which didn't really have to be there in that chain. Now, technological evolution keeps going. We keep coming up with better compressors, better equipment, better methods of construction, but these are all gradual. You're not going to see suddenly a 30% drop in cost, just what happened in the past few years. So there'll be continued evolution, but I kind of caution people that, for example, right now LNG plants the plants we design operate between 92 and 95% efficiency. There's only so much more room to go, if you are a believer in the second law of thermodynamics, which I certainly am. So, there's so much to improve upon the efficiency of these plants. However, when you look at LNG projects, not all of them are like the one that Steve described. Some projects still take 10 years to develop, for example. These are not technological factors. They're all the other factors we've been talking about. And certainly these can be dramatically improved if people just started behaving logically and, rather than irrationally sometimes. That's kind of my plea for world peace and rational behavior.
Can I add one point about and I'm going to steal somebody's comment earlier and build on it. Steve said it earlier in his presentation. Yes, you can drive the costs out, but you got to look at the gas composition you're dealing with. A lot of the projects, as Steve said, the liquids make a big difference. And if also the impurities, that even if you drive the costs out, if you don't have some of that mitigating factor of the liquids being produced with the gas,
it still makes it very difficult to make LNG projects go, because liquids can make up 20 to 30% of the revenue stream from an LNG plant, and it makes a big difference regardless of how much it costs to build the plant.
And Venezuela, that I mentioned yesterday, that the government chose to take liquids out of the project. So it was hobbled before the partners ever hobbled themselves.
Gentleman sitting by the mic, and then you, sir.
Just want to add a little and ask a couple of questions about the project structuring. James, in your presentation, you kind of showed what might be the model for the future. Having experience in some of the projects with very different project structure than what was shown for Trinidad and Egypt, much necessity is the mother of invention, and what's really worked there, what got Trinidad and Egypt going, was figuring out how you could take multiple gas fields with different interests, put them through one and then an expanded LNG train, and sell the LNG without killing everybody in the process through conflicting interests. And the ingenuity that came forward that allowed those projects to go was coming up with a structure that allowed that to happen. How do you take all, I have an interest in one field but not the other. How do I get my LNG to market and make my share of the profit? That's not the model everywhere, nor does it need to be. The opposite, say in Qatar, where you have one field, and even if you subdivide interest there, you have largely parallel sets of interest, don't require that kind of structure and will never go that route because it's not needed. That structure isn't necessarily what made placing the volumes into the market and the flexibility that you showed work. The Qataris are doing that equally. They optimize their cargoes all the time, and without having multiple sellers. There's one seller, but they have the worldwide market out there, and they've got many buyers out of individual trains, and they do the optimization themselves. So there really are a lot of ways to skin the cat. I think your example tells me that, people have got to sit down and be rational and develop a structure for the reality that they're faced with. And faced with that, if they don't do it in a matter of a year, 2 years, 3 years, the world passes them by. I think, to me, that's kind of the message that I gain out of what Trinidad and Egypt have been able to do.
Well, first of all, I was talking about the Atlantic, what opened it, and it made it a flexible market. And frankly, advising Amoco in 94 about what structure they might look at, we suggested a modified Bontang structure without the state company, because the state company chose not to be the regulator in Trinidad. And I think all the structures are unique to an area, and I'm totally contrary to saying here's one mold and stick it everywhere. But where I would take slight exception to what you said is that in Qatar, there's been a debate, should we just wrap up RAS gas and Qatar gas into one and have one big entity? I think they get a lot of benefit by having those two entities, and now we're going to have new Qatar gas entities, competing with each other for the way they perform in the market, the way they build ships, the way they the way they place product. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think that with the new model where, as you pointed out yesterday, ExxonMobil is going to be the biggest buyer in the world, ExxonMobil is the seller in the market, not Qatar gas. And that means that what we now have is multiple sellers from Qatar, not at the point where the ship is loaded, but certainly at the point where it unloads. And therefore, I think that whereas it wasn't done by adapting the project structure, it was done by adapting the contract structure, and that those people will be able to introduce the flexibility and work in the traded market in a way that they couldn't do in, say, Qatar gas to Chubu, which is a very restricted thing. The other thing I just wanted to say, in reply to Philippe, is that paradoxically, these new flexible structures and the inflexible structures can exist side by side and even in new projects. Because what I didn't show you on Egypt was the whatever it's now called, basically the Union Fenosa project in Egypt, which is a rigid integrated chain thing, entirely different model, new again, but a completely different structure. And so you can get two side by side, adapting to the world in different ways, and it's what works, not what works in theory.
I think one thing we can also learn is the reflection on the oil business. If you go back into the 1920s, oil was a little bit similar. We didn't sell oil, we sold products, and we had refineries connected to oil fields, and we had the suppliers essentially net backing all the way from the market. And now we're having coexisting today multiple structural options, multiple combinations, multiple partnerships, multiple ownerships, multiple rent systems. And I think we're going that way with the gas. And it'll be horses for courses for quite some time. I doubt there'll be one model. The Equatorial Guinea model is a unique model yet again. And I think we need to also bear in mind that the drivers are going to be the market again, just in the same way as they were with the oil. Ultimately, it was the oil markets that sucked in the new change, and variable producers sold oil to variable refiners. So I think we are going to see, and have seen, the beginnings of a big change away from the railroad model we saw in Japan.
Thank you, Steve.
Ken, I was struck by two things in your presentation. One, the conclusion that Russia was going to become the monopolist for both East and West, which implies a change in the way in which they deliver both places, obviously to China and the East. And the view that essentially the Saudi Arabians were going to become the Middle East suppliers, eclipsing Qatar and Iran, which in the short term appear to be the big suppliers with short-term reserves. And I guess what I'd like to understand is whether that new gas that's going to support these changes is coming out of existing proved reserves or whether it is coming out of resources that are, in the resource base. Now, one of the interesting things, when you do your reserve to production ratio internationally, there are tremendous reserves in excess of demand. But one of the things that has permitted is the LNG industry and the pipeline industry has had the luxury of cherry-picking reserves. Essentially, if you look at projects, most of them have names. They're names of fields, giant fields that are anchors for a particular project. And as you start moving up that chain, the question is, are the ones that are not now cherries going to be brought on by technology and keep costs constant, or will costs rise? Now, let's say you look at Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian reserves are dominantly, at this point, associated, dissolved. They are only produced when the oil is produced, if the oil production is down. And the Saudis themselves don't want to deal with international trade based on that. The real question comes if the gas initiative in Saudi Arabia finds a lot of gas in the Permian Kuf formation that underlines the Arab member, and we don't know that yet. But in fact, potentially that could happen, but that's the resource base. That's not the proved reserve. If you look at Russia, the fascinating thing there is that the Western Siberian trade is based on three big fields, predominantly three big fields in the West. That is really Urengoy, which is the second largest field in the world, Yamburg, the third largest field in the world, and Medvedje. All of those fields now are in decline. What the Russians are doing at this point is bringing on Zapolyarny, which is another one of the giants, in order to keep production constant. And there are a lot of what are called the Urengoy satellites that can be brought on time to keep the existing production constant. If you're going to look at expansion, what the Russians were doing was the Yamal Peninsula. And you've got three huge giants there, Bovinenko, Karasave, and Krusenstern, that were going to be the anchor for the Yamal pipeline. Now, when David talked yesterday about bypassing Poland and all that, he mentioned that the Yamal pipeline is no longer has anything to do with Yamal. The reason it doesn't is that when the Russians finally looked at it, the economics were terrible because it's very costly. Then you move out into the Barents Sea, you've got Stockmanov, and Stockmanov is rich in liquids. Everybody drools over Stockmanov, but it sits right next to the ice. And essentially, you can't put a standing platform there. You have to do a subsea completion. And how you get energy to bring the stuff into Murmansk and use that for LNG is complicated. And then there are two huge reserve fields to the east of that. They're under the ice and are dry. Now, the reserves are huge, but in fact, you've got cost and technical challenges to bring those on. And if they're going to be the anchors for big expansions, you've got to do something with that. And all I'm saying is that I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that the computer says you can do that because I'm not sure that I think you can. But anyway, I'd love to know what the computer has done relative to proved reserves and relative to the resource base as a base for these two challenges.
In answer to your question regarding Saudi Arabia, it's growing into resource base. That's what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the Saudi Arabian export market does not really grow until about 2025 in the model. So we're talking 20 years from now. With regard to Russia, Western Siberia in particular, you're growing into the resource base again. And with the growth that we're seeing in China longer term, there is sufficient market pull for those resources to develop and actually build west to east. And so that's what's happening there. All of these things are development are all predicated on price versus cost. So you have to earn the rent to support the capital investment for these projects to go. So that sort of information is incorporated in the development of these reserves. And reserve development or resource development is not homogeneous throughout the model. It is geographically distinct. So those sorts of factors are included.
Perhaps if I can add to your question, the conclusion we've come to is Stockman gas is going to be more expensive to make LNG. It's going to raise the price of LNG. And the Yamana gas is exactly the same. It's going to be expensive to produce. But when you get to the Yamar Peninsula, you have a lot of condensate. So ultimately, the condensate will drive the LNG projects. So it'll be an oil-based business with LNG on the back of it.
Thank you. DeForest Ralph, the gas price report. This is a kind of collateral question or collateral issue addressed to both the Chevron Texaco and the Marathon presentations. The Marathon presentation showed production of propane, and the Chevron Texaco man talked about sustainable development, which is what all companies talk about now in overseas development. But I think particularly in West Africa, to what extent are you trying to develop a propane indigenous market or use propane so that the local people can use it as a source of energy so where they don't have to cut down the trees all the time and promote global warming by burning wood, and can also use it as a source of energy for local electricity so that you can get a gaseous fuel out into the middle of Africa without having to build pipelines and all that infrastructure, and kind of build up a gas industry the way it was built up in Mexico, where it's still largely propane and propane-butane mix. And then this would also help the problem of your LNG plants not leaving as much propane in the gas and making the gas so hot when it comes in. Could you describe a little bit what you're doing about the propane relative to developing markets for it in Africa?
Yeah, if I pick up that question first, I think to your point on social issues, that underlies everything we do in our industry, and that's just not Marathon. It's all of our peers have pretty much the same approach. We have to earn the right in every country we work in to be an investor. Therefore, we have to put as much back into society as we possibly can. I think when you talk about the LPG issue, whether it's propane or butane, we do look to take the liquids out at site if we can. That's partly because the U.S. market likes lean LNG, so it's good for us to do that. But there are local markets. They don't actually need to be built. They're already there. It's mainly a cooking fuel, so it's a very easy fuel to build and distribute. But it's a tiny, tiny volume. We are supplying 100% of the LPG for Bioko Island, and that's a minor, minor piece of our production. In fact, we're also supplying 100% of the electricity for the island, and we hardly notice the amount of gas we put into the system. I think you've got to appreciate the scale of these projects versus the local demand issues.
I think in terms of, for Chevron Texaco, I think the example I can speak to is Angola. They have an LPG business there in the major cities, and they get that production from the local oil production cities, plus they import some. But what they're seeing as part of the development of LNG and why they're so keen to see an onshore LNG development is, one is to basically bring the gas onshore to be a catalyst for industrial development based on gas, but also to enhance the propane deliverability and butane deliverability in the country. So that's been part of the development plan for the project. And that's why a lot of times some of these host governments and host countries they want to see infrastructure built onshore because for that very reason. that they can leverage off of that to supply their indigenous needs for things other than. But I share with Steve, it is a small volume relative to the amount of gas you're pulling through and the amount of propane and butane you are producing. If it's a rich gas, is far more than most countries can use for that specific reason, unless they need a large chemical feedstock. Maybe the only alternative that would need a large demand. But I agree, it's really cooking gas in West Africa.
Okay, thank you. I think we have room for one more quick question, because otherwise timing again will take the lead.
Okay, Michael Weston, Gas Strategies. There's a couple of questions, actually, if I may. For James. Okay. You mentioned all the complexities about Trinidad, and I'm just thinking that it was a dream for consultants, or maybe it was a dream that consultants created. But I would submit to you that also Trinidad had it somewhat easy, in that it was in an industrial environment with established infrastructure and established skilled manpower basis. And I wonder if you can just make some contrast between that and Nigeria and perhaps Angola, which are on the other side of the Atlantic, which had a much more difficult thing. A couple of things related to that is that if you've got an NOC with a small share, the financing of that is really kind of easy. And I think that's key. Second thing is if you've got a few partners only in a project, then that's great. More partners, the complexity goes up exponentially. And a quick one for Amos, really. Just to comment on single feed versus dual feed. I think one of the issues there is that if you go for a single feed, then the contractor that does the single feed may, in the competitive environment and fair play conditions that some companies would insist on, he will be precluded from bidding for the EPC. And last point for Bechtel, I trust, Amos, that you can assure us that when Bechtel is bidding, it's more on the price of your refrigerator than on your wife's.
Just to take that issue, yes, Trinidad did have an easier go, but let's remember, as I said, they made a macroeconomic choice to reform their economy. And it was not an accident that NGC was given a 10% non-controlling interest. That was a conscious decision of government policy. Yes, it made it easier to finance. The difficulty would have been if NGC had been allowed, as they originally requested, to control the pipeline and run it through the national grid, which the lenders absolutely refused to accept. So a dedicated pipeline was built and a compromise was developed. As I said, the partners, whatever simplicity the partners had given to them, they took away by their relations with each other. And in the end, they compromised into that structure, which, as we saw, was not the ideal one for their situation. But it was, it was one of these things that worked in practice, not in theory. They got there quickly, which is what their number one aim was, and then they improved on it. I was talking to Amos about this yesterday. He said that same plant with all the technology benefits available would have cost 50% more in Venezuela. There is a choice of the Venezuela government. There is a choice of the social relations in the country. It probably would have cost 50% more in Australia as well, I might add, which is an industrial environment. So these sort of things, while they appear to be a given that the LNG inherits, I think that we need to recognize, this being a political conference, that a lot of these are established by the macroeconomic policy of the government, whose importance is often underestimated when we talk about energy, and we think energy is the policy of the Energy Department. And I think the idea of focusing a lot more on macroeconomic policy is important, and I think the degree to which the Nigeria partners, who I didn't mean to slag off yesterday, the degree to which Nigeria partners worked very hard to educate the entire cabinet, and not just NMPC and not just the energy minister, contributed greatly to their overcoming the massive hurdles that the government would have otherwise thrown in their place.
Well, just one quick point about what Mike made, which is a very good point, is I don't think it's good practice to have somebody build your plant who did not do the front-end engineering, because that contractor then does have an opportunity to bring all that they know about building plants to where it matters, which is in the front end. That's where all the decisions are being made about the plant. So I think it's an excellent point, and if that's the case, maybe dual feed is maybe the right way to go. I'm not a big proponent of dual feeds because in most cases, other than Atlantic LNG, of course, they don't seem to add much. They increase the cost, they increase the schedule, and I believe there are other ways that owners can ensure they're getting a competitive price without doing a dual feed, but that doesn't hold everywhere. There are many countries in the world that believe that they must have so-called transparency, and if that's the way to ensure transparency, fine. We've built plants in any one of these ways, and we may have opinions which one's more effective, but it's clearly up to the owners and the conditions in the country to dictate which method can actually be used.
All right, I think that this was a great morning. As far as I'm concerned, at least, I have many, many more questions I'd like to ask, but I'll be limited as you are, and so I think Amy wants to take it over, but thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers.
Well, I want to thank everybody for a very interesting morning session. We are going to have lunch in the same place as yesterday, which is across the Fountainway. There'll be people from the Baker Institute to sort of point you in the right direction. We're a little more casual today. We're having barbecue, and there will be 2 buffet lines. So same as yesterday, open seating. So take some time to relax and visit with friends. And one last thing. I'm feeling very school teacherish. I'm giving you an assignment for lunch. You're going to have a casual, pleasant lunch, but I'm leaving you with an assignment. When we come back for the afternoon session, we'll have one more substantive session, and then we're going to have our closing session with insights from Jim Jensen and Ed Morse. But we also would like you, the audience, to help us and participate, as Mr. Baker and Ambassador Regent emphasized at the beginning of our session. The mission of the Baker Institute is really to bring together practitioners and scholars to really have a dialogue, to enhance our understanding of the forces that move the energy world, and also of the proper policy formation that comes as a result is understanding those forces clearly. And you've all been incredible audience, very thoughtful, very interesting questions. We need your input in the final session to hear what areas you think the study needs to be enhanced, what areas should we maybe we have not covered extensively, that in your knowledge and participation in the business, you think there's other areas that you'd like to see covered, or you have comments on some of the conclusions and insights on some of the conclusions. We would very much like to have your participation and feedback. Because this is still a work in progress. We know we printed everything up so you could take it home and read it. And it looks very finished, but actually the ultimate product of this effort is going to be a book volume. And we still have a way to go. We're still tinkering with the model. So we're very much interested in your perspectives on this first stage of the research. Thank you very much. We'll see you back after lunch.